All right. Thanks for joining today. We're going to cover incident response. Everybody should know me by now, so I won't take time here. Be covering typical topics with incident response, as well as some updates from Delta training. So nomenclature and assumptions slide has stayed the same. As in the bottom, though, what I had posted last month that they had released the Delta training. I have completed the training. The content that was on there, we were advised through the recordings that we're not allowed to replicate or share the content. Therefore, I didn't take screenshots or post anything in the slide deck so that I don't violate any of their rules or regulations. But just at a high level, to give you guys an idea of what was covered, this was a get you caught up to CMMC 2.0. And most of you should recall that 2.0 was announced back in November of last year. So it was literally about 7 months before they produced this training, trying to get us, hey, what did we do in 1.0 that's different? So the majority of it really wasn't useful. If you've been coming to my sessions, if you've been involved with it at your own organization, most of what they've covered has already been published out in the news, things that are on the slides right now. A couple things they did point out, though, was that the CMMC AB website was going to be changing in the next upcoming months. So expect to see some new form or version of that website. Also, new templates and documentation would be made available, although they did not give a time frame on when that would be produced and whether or not that would be posted one at a time as they get it, or if they're going to kind of do like a revamp and post all of it at once. They did talk about having forums where you can ask questions with the CMMC community and hopefully get some answers, although I would still say a lot of it might be speculation because there was no concrete guidance that was given in the training. It was about 5 hours of training. There was a lot of downloads if you're a registered practitioner, but again, it wasn't, we're not allowed to share the content. It was primarily focused on level 1 training, which is ironic because CUI is the thing that most people talk about. A large number of contractors will need to be level 2 certified, whether it ends up being self-attest or through a C3 PAO. But the content of the training itself seemed to really focus around level 1. They did go in and talk about different scenarios and things which had CUI, which then implied level 2 or level 3, but always kind of reverted back to level 1. They did give examples of topologies of how your network might be set up and what impact that has, how you work with other vendors and what impact that has. One of the things that was most common and what I've been saying all along, and I hope it doesn't change, is it depends what type of data you have and where you're going to store that data and how you grant access to it to help define what's within your boundaries. So as many of you might be dealing with CUI at some point in time, some of the solutions that we offered in Ntiva get the CUI out of your corporate environment, you restrict access, and therefore make certain components of your network potentially out of scope. And they did have a section called specialized assets, which they say are not part of the assessment. They gave some examples like operational technology, Internet of Things, government property, test equipment, restricted information systems. So there were a bunch of categories that they considered out of scope, at least within FCI assets, and I would assume that would be CUI as long as CUI didn't exist there. So they were giving some latitude there. They did talk a lot about making sure things were isolated, not on the same VLAN or subnet as different FCI or CUI systems. So depending on how you segment your network, where you put your data, it does appear like with all other certifications that you have a way to reduce that scope and size of your boundary. Beyond that, the one thing that I would say I'd call out that was extremely important, and again, what we've been covering here, is that even though CMMC is using NIST 800-171, every time they showed a screenshot of a control or a practice, as they call it, they always seem to reference 800-53, all the supplemental material. And the way they did it, and if you can visualize this, is here's what the control states, here's what some of the supplemental data and 853 says. Now, what is the intent of the control? And they've already published documentation to help you with this. But when you go and look at the intent of the control, they're saying, here's what the auditor would be looking for. Here's the types of questions the auditor would ask. And when you look at it, it will be clear to you that that's far more in depth than what the control states in 171. But the control in 171 may be very broad, vague, a simple sentence, and then there's a paragraph of subcomponents that an auditor is looking for. So I do know through a lot of Ntiva clients that they will do their self-assessment and they'll come in with a very high score. Let's call it 70 and above for argument's sake. And my fear is always that if you're just reading the sentence that's in 171, that may seem valid. But if you go back and dig into 853 and the supplemental data and materials that they provide, the likelihood is that you're not actually scoring that high. So not sure how much that helps, but just wanted to put that out there that, again, if they allow us to start sharing the data, I'll be happy to include it in the slides, but I didn't want to violate any of their rules and regulations. Moving specifically to incident response, there were quite a few family-specific resources here. So even though it's a very small family, only 3 controls that we're covering, there were among the most number of references that they expect you to go and read. And I think the reason for that is when you read the actual NIST documentation and they talk about incident response, in one paragraph, they'll put 10, 15, 20 different topics, technologies, concepts, all wrapped into one. So it's very difficult just to easily say, I do this or I don't do this as you go sentence by sentence and say, well, I'm doing some of this, but maybe not all of it. And I'll give you some examples here as we go through the couple slides. So as I just previously stated, there are only 3 practices. The 3 listed here really talking about having an incident handling capability for your systems. Notice that they talk about preparation, detection, analysis, containment, recovery, and user activities. So they're talking about more than simply just having an incident response plan, ways to track, document, and report incidents, and then how to test your capability. So, you know, if all you read was this at a high level, I think a lot of people could come back and say, I can or have created something that satisfies all of these. But as we dig in deeper, you'll see that that's probably not the case. So looking at the first one, the controls are calling for prevention, which is what most of the people who come to me, my team, and Ntiva are really focused on. But they also call out containment and recovery. That tends to be an afterthought for the majority of people I work with. It's all about what can I buy, what can I do that's going to prevent it. And in this day and age, as we'll talk more about it, it's less about stopping it and how you react once it happens. There's a lot of tools that are helpful. Tools do a great job of quickly detecting incidents. They do a great job of scanning logs, correlating data faster than any human can, and understanding all the different types of language that are involved in these logs. But they don't necessarily do a great job in analyzing it and giving you a, here's what you should do, or here's my level of confidence. So what I mean by that is you can look at a tool and you can say, well, the data says someone is trying to log in from 2 different locations at the same time. But the tool has no idea that the person might be logging in once through a home internet connection and then trying to log in through VPN. If it's happening close enough in a time frame, going through VPN might send you through a different part of the country. It's going to appear as if a person's in 2 locations at the same time. You rely on the people and processes at that point to take that data and makes use of it in some way, shape, or form. So while I absolutely support tools, especially in the roles of automation, the people and processes play a huge role. If you're outsourcing this, as a lot of customers do with Ntiva, understand that even if you're outsourcing the SOC portion of it, which is a lot of where the people portion is made up, and the tool portion, the internal process is equally important. And I'll explain why here in a second. One of the things that I think people forget about are the stuff that's out of the norm from the way we think, but not necessarily out of the norm from what happens in real life. When we think about security incidents, we immediately think about a hack or an attack. But we don't often think about things like insider threats. And one example, there's many that fall under insider threats, would be disgruntled employees. If you have a disgruntled employee who has access to system and is exfiltrating data for whatever their malicious purpose, the tools likely are not going to detect it unless it's done in a large capacity or in a weird time frame, and the tool has to be configured and monitored specifically for that. This person's already an employee, this person already has access, so by default, accessing and moving and transferring data is normal behavior. That is a much more difficult thing to pick up on than it would be someone compromising an account and logging in from another country. Things like active shooters, if you still have physical space and you get an active shooter environment, or you're talking about the security threats that might be included from a natural disaster. What if a natural disaster affects the building that you're in, and now you have no way to secure the assets that are inside it? All of these things are really considered security incidents, but as we talk about testing our security capabilities, rarely does anyone think about these types of things. The first thing they want to think of is, a power outage in my data center. My internet connection is severed. Maybe someone's digging up in front of their building and cuts a line. Those are all absolutely valid things to test for, but I want to point out that I think you should expand your frame of thought into anything that's conceivable that could affect security. Once you do that, the next bullet will then make more sense in that you really need to ensure departments such as HR, legal, and finance are involved. Most people will anticipate that the IT department, whether that be in-house or outsourced, some form of service desk, security team, a SOC, that they're going to be the main drivers. And they will, as far as being able to answer a lot of the questions of what's happening, when did it happen, who is it affecting, what's our impact. But when we talk about, do we need to report? Who do we report to? We need to make a business decision. Are we going to law enforcement or not? Now, all of a sudden, security and IT are not the people who answer these questions. If we're talking about active shooters, disgruntled employees, does HR need to be involved? Do you need to monitor employees? What documentation might they have that will lend to your investigation because maybe they knew about something that you didn't, and vice versa? I've seen a lot of incident response plans that leave out other departments because they're so used to working incidents and never dealing with them. At a minimum, I think everyone should have a table in their incident response plan that has essentially someone from every department in your organization. If you never call upon these people, fine, you don't have to use it. But if they're at least aware that they could play a role in the event that you need them, you're not hunting for people. I can't tell you the number of incidents that my team has covered at Ntiva, as well as past organizations, where in the middle of an active security incident, that's when people are trying to figure out who should be involved. You waste too much time, precious time, honestly, trying to figure that out. The next bullet plays along with that as well, in that you want to identify stakeholders and decision makers well in advance of the incident. Stakeholders, from this respect, I kind of look at the people who need to be informed or receive consent from. They may not be making the decisions, but they at least need to know about it. You're going up the right chain of command, you're going over to the right departments, the right people might have to answer for something that you're doing. So it's more about getting the communications out to them. And then it's also about limiting communications. When you're dealing with a security incident, the whole org doesn't need to know about it. You really want to keep it on a need to know basis. So how do you answer the question, who needs to know, if you haven't identified those stakeholders? You also want to have the decision makers well in advance. One of the strategies that I see a lot of organizations do when they draft incident response plans or policies is they'll just take the highest titled person in each department and list them as the point of contact. The problem with that is that may or may not work. That person may have or may not have any idea what you're talking about, what they deal with, and they may not even be the decision maker. Just because you, for example, work in finance, and maybe you're the head of finance, doesn't mean that you're going to be the decision maker when it comes to business continuity. That may come from somebody else. You may be in a conflict with legal or HR. So making sure you have the right people and they can make decisions is important. We see it a lot in IT, on the IT side, where when we go back and we say, okay, we need to sever a connection between two different network segments, or we need to take your internet down, and maybe you're an e-commerce business, for example, who's going to give us the authority to do that? If you're able to still work and make money, finance is probably going to want to keep the website up and running. if you're being hacked or you're going through a ransomware attack, time is of the essence, and security is going to want to shut it down. Someone's got to be able to make that decision, and it's almost never security. I don't know if that's a new concept to a lot of folks. Maybe you haven't been through security incidents, but security's job essentially is to identify risk, make recommendations, but the business has to decide. Hopefully the business will listen to security based on the severity of the incident, as well as the track record and trust that's been built. But at the end of the day, security is almost never the one making the decisions. Again, I bring this up and harp on this because the last thing you want is to be in the middle of an attack. You're in the C-suite, you're wondering what security is going to do, and security sitting there going, I don't know, tell me what you want me to do. Or I've given you 3 options you need to pick, and you don't know who can make that decision. Another one will be determine if forensic capabilities will be needed. A lot of folks don't think of this in advance. If you're working, say, as a federal contractor, if you have government responsibility to maintain an asset and provide forensics, do you even have the capability, and how does that affect your plan? Most people that I've seen want to shut things down as soon as something happens, because when you shut it down, you limit the spreading of whatever's taking place. That's valid from a security perspective. When you shut things down, though, you lose a lot of forensic capabilities. You need to know in advance whether or not that's a requirement. And probably the most important one, and it's something that's been really gaining a lot of traction over the last 3 to 5 years in the security community and a lot of security conferences, is this right of boom perspective. So if we look at the control where it says preparation, detection, analysis, containment, recovery, consider that the timeline, and the left of boom is all of the prevention and preparation and detection, and the right of boom is all of the containment, analysis, containment, and recovery. Some of these will obviously kind of go back and forth as you learn more information. But if you just look at it, right of boom means after something has happened. That's where we need to spend more time and more money and more focus. You can put all the money in the world into the tools to try to prevent something, but eventually something's bad is going to happen. Eventually you're going to be hacked. Eventually you're going to fall victim to a phishing attempt, whatever. And if all of your effort is into the prevention side, what will you do once it occurs? The second one's a little bit smaller here. This one is very dependent upon the industry vertical you work in, what contracts you might have, client expectations, cyber insurance providers. But you have to look at your organization and the work you do and identify who within the organization must be informed. Again, this is talking about stakeholders and making sure the right people have the right comms, while also not telling people who have no reason to know about it. You also need to know whether or not you have to comply with local law enforcement. Are there state officials, government officials, federal government? Are there executive orders that have been passed that you have to abide by? And if you're on a contract with the federal government, any contracting officers or contracting officer representatives that have to be notified. A lot of state and federal contracts will say you must inform the Corps, and then you must also inform US CERT or the FBI or whoever. You have to know this in advance. A lot of them have portals you have to log into, forms that have to be filled out, specific forms to their agency, specific people that have to be contacted. The last thing that you want is to be in the middle of an incident or post-incident, and you still don't know who and when you were supposed to report. And each one of these can have different requirements. So it's not as simple as to say, well, as long as I checked on one, I'm good. As you get down to more of the state and local level, especially at the local level, it may become more of the frameworks that you fall under. So if you're supposed to be HIPAA compliant, for example, you may have to notify someone. If you have no framework that you really have to fall under or no certification, then a lot of it becomes a business decision. One of the things that I get asked quite often is, should I contact local law enforcement if something has happened, and then someone will give me a hypothetical? That's really a business decision. It's great to involve local law enforcement voluntarily because maybe they can help, maybe they can capture the person, maybe they can help recover financial losses. But when you report something like that you're not required to report, you also put it out there in public view. A lot of companies don't want to do that. Being ethical, I would say, obviously, we want to err on the side of doing the right thing, but business decisions get made, again, not by security, and a lot of times this piece is skipped for said reason. Make sure that you're considering events and incidents when you test and when you build these plans that might have legal ramifications. If you do business with people in Europe, for example, or data from Europe, GDPR comes into play. If you're working in California, CPRA comes into play. Different states like New York, I know, have drafted language. Every state is different. Some states may have requirements, some may not. Knowing where your data is, what to do with it, how to report on it, that's all a legal requirement. And we've seen through different cases with social media companies, for example, that a single breach or a single incident could cost millions of dollars in fines. Well, if you're a social media company and you're making $1 billion, $1 million fine is not a big deal. If your company's net worth is $1 million and you get $1 million fine, that has a vastly different effect on whether or not you're still in business. So please make sure you're looking into that. And then for all of them, make sure you understand their reporting process requirements. Again, they all have something different. They don't all respond quickly. Even when, if you win a new contract or you're going after an RFP, just getting answers from people of who do I contact? Is the phone number and the person and the email address, is it accurate? Are they still with the organization? You might be on on a contract whose RFP was written 5 years ago. What's the likelihood the person that they said to reach out to is still there? What timelines do you have for reporting? Every contract is different. Every agency can be different. One might be 72 hours, one might be 48. And then how do you know when you've crossed that threshold? I've seen contracts that say when you have confirmed a breach occurred, you must notify. Well, there's two pieces to that. One, it had to be a breach, and two, you had to confirm that it occurred. If you aren't sure it was a breach, or you aren't sure someone, you can't confirm that someone had access to data, only that they compromised an account, but I don't know if they could do anything with it. A lot of organizations fail to report because they'll say it doesn't meet the threshold for reporting. You must absolutely know whether or not you have a threshold that you have to adhere to. And again, this is one of the most difficult things to do in a timely manner, which is why I say do it in advance. I get asked that all the time. What should I do? Who do I have to go to in the middle of a security incident? And honestly, besides the fact that we don't have time to figure that out, you're pulling resources away from containing and eradicating a serious security incident to talk about what you should have been able to do well in advance of the incident. That's not a good use of our resources at that time. And probably the most important from a non-legal liability perspective, because the first two slides are more or less your legal obligations, is testing your incident response capability. Everybody talks about, do I have backups? But are the backups good? I've worked in numerous organizations where they backed things up daily, weekly, whatever the case may be. And when they went to restore, some things restored without a hitch, some didn't restore at all, and some did a partial restore, and then they had to manually complete work. I've seen power outages in data centers that fry a UPS or some circuit board. What should be a simple reboot and come online once the data center has bypassed power and got it over to you, all of a sudden takes 5 days, 9 days to get everything back up and running. That's really not the time to find out your backups didn't work. You also want to build a tabletop test library. This is just a bunch of scenarios that you can test that are specific to your organization. There's no point going online and trying to copy somebody else's. You can go look for basic scenarios, common scenarios, but you need to look at your organization. If you don't have a physical facility, what would be the point of testing a physical response capability? So look at your environment, and then as you build the library, obviously update it. Year by year, you might be making major changes to your environment, and your library should change as well. Most importantly, have a lessons learned from each of these scenarios and do something about it. I also can't tell you the number of times I've gone through maintenance weekends, tabletop testing. Every one of them had a lessons learned, and every month or every quarter, whatever the frequency was, our next lesson learned was documenting the same thing we documented in the previous lessons learned. They're useless if you're not doing anything with them. And quite honestly, I think they're a legal liability, because if you are breached and you've been doing these and you knew you had a problem and you documented it and did nothing about it, you really aren't doing your job from a due care, due diligence perspective. Mature these libraries and the scenarios over time as you get better at responding to these, make them more difficult, make them more realistic. You might start with just a paper exercise talking about walking through something, but as your teams get better, they get a little more cohesive. Maybe you work up to a non-prod environment scenario, and maybe at some point you want to actually test failover in production. So you pick a holiday weekend when nobody's using the equipment, but mature that over time and come out of it with answering two major questions. This is part of project management, and I think it works well with lessons learned. Did the teams involved follow your process? And were those processes effective? A lot of times people will not follow the process that was documented. And then in the end, they'll say, well, our incident response plan was no good. You actually don't know if the plan was any good because no one followed it. So if everyone follows it and you still have deficiencies, use lessons learned to make them better. If people aren't following them, use your lessons learned to fix that. Someone needs to be in charge and they need to follow your process. There's no way to answer one question without answering them, the other. And then last here, just kind of consider your business continuity needs and identify critical systems. Everybody doesn't have the same environment, system, business plan, etc. I cannot come to you and say that this server in this environment is equally as important as this server in another environment. You have to know that. One of the easiest ways to say that is, if this asset were to go down for 24 hours, what would the impact be? And just go asset by asset doing that. Pick whatever time you want, 4 hours, 8 hours, 24 hours, I don't care. But make a list of those assets and then pick what would happen to your company if it was down. What would happen if it went down and you had to replace it? I've seen a lot of people buy networking equipment, physical equipment in offices where they have a single router, a single firewall, a single switch, and something goes wrong. Where are you going to get a enterprise, quality switch or router, same day, next day? Even if you have a warranty plan through a vendor, it might take a couple days for you to process that request. They get it mailed to you. You have to configure it, get it up. If you can go down to Best Buy and just replace a $100 network switch, that's not a problem. But think of those things and identify them in advance and see whether or not you're prepared and how well you respond. You don't need to have Ntiva, as an example, work with you on a major scenario if you can build a lot of these yourselves. And in a lot of cases, they don't have to be large security incidents. They can be simple ones like someone accidentally cut a wire, someone tripped over a wire. Just run them. They don't focus 100% on security, but as you do build these scenarios, if you have any in there that are not security related, think of what the security impact might be. And again, I say go back to like your active shooter scenario. What happens if an active shooter comes in, does something, and then what effect does it have? And on that note, I know we're coming up to the bottom of the hour. I do not see any questions in the chat, but I hope this was useful and beneficial to you. I hope it gives you a different perspective. And if I can get any more information or any updated training information comes out, I will be happy to pass that along, as well as documentation should they change their stance on whether we could share. And on that note, you guys have a great afternoon, and we'll see you next month.